It's a pleasure to introduce Gene Reeves, whom many of you know over long decades as a friend and as an associate of the Center for Process Studies, even though he hails from afar, from at least 3 different places. Chicago first, where he was head of Meadville Lombard from 1979 to 1988, and a professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Upon moving to Tokyo and to other parts of Japan, he has taught at Tsukuba University, at Rikyo University, and at Renmin University in Japan. He is currently a professor at Renmin University in Beijing, while remaining an international advisor for Risho Kosei Kai in Tokyo. For the last 25 years, Gene has been researching and lecturing throughout the world on the important Buddhist text, the Lotus Sutra. He has published a new and highly readable and very well acclaimed translation of the Lotus Sutra. His most recent publication is Stories of the Lotus Sutra. He will be speaking today on David Griffin's writings and treatment of morality. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to begin by just kind of expressing a word of gratitude to the organizers of this conference. David Griffin and I have been friends since about 1967. And I have neglected and failed in recent years to follow all of his publications. He writes more than I can read. So it's really been pleasure for me to be back here and getting a better, more overall view of David's very important work. And that's been a really kind of educational process for me. So I'm very grateful to those who organized and sponsored this conference for holding the conference and especially for inviting me. I do feel a little bit like maybe like a fish who's jumped out of one pond into another. I went to Japan nearly 25 years ago with the idea that I would study the Lotus Sutra. But somehow, if you study something, you wind up also doing a lot of talking about it and teaching it, and even in my case, translating it and things of that kind. So I've sort of been living in a different environment. And now for the last couple of years, I've been teaching in China. And so I've sort of been swimming in a different pond. And one of the reasons I went to Japan and wanted to study the Lotus Sutra is because I was very much inspired by John Cobb's book, A Christian Natural Theology. And I wanted to produce a Buddhist natural theology. And actually, I've written 2 or 3 chapters of that book, but it's sort of been put aside, while I concentrated more intently on the Lotus Sutra itself. And I think I'm planning I will retire from Renmin University at the end of this semester, and we're not exactly sure what our living situation will be in Tokyo and Chicago, but I really think, John, that I'm going to try to go back, and I'm doing another translation right now. I think I'm going to set that aside and try to really get that book done, in which on the one hand we talk about the Lotus Sutra and the other hand about process thought. So that's one of the outcomes, I think, of this conference. Now, my assignment is to talk about David Griffin and morality. David's written a lot, as I indicated, and I haven't read it all. It's a very substantial body of work that David has given to us. But his work in morality or ethics is relatively not as large. But on the other hand, he's hardly been silent. Much of what he's published in this area is a conversation among, I would say, mainly among philosophers and others interested in what we could term meta-ethics. Basically, the attempt not to discern what is moral or immoral so much as to examine the grounds or absence thereof of any possible morality. Their concerns are not so much with substantive moral issues such as assisted suicide or abortion or assassination, but with how or whether moral judgments of any kind can be justified. One might gain an impression from the few things that I've read of David Griffin's on morality that such philosophical, meta-ethical matters are Griffin's main concern. But I think this is not where Griffin's interest in moral theory begins or ends. He begins, I believe, with a recognition, now quite common, if not universal, that the world is in a crisis. This crisis comes in many forms, including terrorism, environmental pollution and degradation, natural resource depletion, climate change, population growth and overpopulation, imperialism, the growing gap between the rich and the poor with increasing rule of the world by the rich, idealization of economic growth, and we could go on and on. For Griffin, this world in crisis constitutes the present world order, an order that not only allows billions of people, billions of human beings, this is a quote, allows billions of human beings to sink below the line beneath which no one should be allowed to sink, it pushes them under. It is an oppressive environment. The present world is a war system, a system of global anarchy in which conflicts of interest can only be resolved through coercive power, typically through military means. This would include, I suppose, using drones to assassinate people suspected of being enemies of the state. It's a system of international anarchy because there is no recognized authority above that of individual nation states. There's some little exceptions to that, but generally that's the case. The United Nations, far from qualifying or limiting state sovereignty, is based on it. It's not to the slightest degree a global government, but rather a treaty organization in which 5 nation states each have veto power over the whole United Nations. What the world needs, Griffin affirms, is a real world government, a global democracy apparently patterned after the US government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The creation of a global democracy, says Griffin, is a moral imperative, the only means by which we can hope to overcome the various problems threatening the very survival of civilization. But such a global democracy can only be based on overcoming state sovereignty and the war system. And this overcoming must be impartial. Control of the world by a single empire, which seems to be the direction in which we're moving, control of the world by a single empire will not do. Since it would not be democratic, it would be incapable of dealing impartially with any of the problems that constitute the world crisis. Such impartiality requires objective, universal moral principles, a global ethic in which moral norms are perceived as part of the very fabric of the universe. We need a global ethic, he says, a set of moral norms that are accepted by all societies. Such a global ethic requires overcoming contemporary moral nihilism. If by nihilism, I quote, if by nihilism one means a disbelief in the possibility of justifying moral judgments in some rational way, and if philosophers reflect the intellectual climate of the times, then our age is truly nihilistic. At no period in Western history, writes Paul Edwards, have so many philosophers regarded moral statements as somehow arbitrary. This moral nihilism, Griffin avers, constitutes a crisis in contemporary moral theory. And this brings Griffin into conversation with a wide variety of ethical or moral theorists. In doing the good of all or anything else, if doing the good of all or anything else is to be regarded as a universally valid moral principle, it has to be possible to provide a rational defense of such a principle, and beyond that, motivation for people to follow it. Among the major issues in contemporary moral theory in the West is the issue of moral autonomy, or maybe I should, ethical autonomy. The idea that morality should be entirely independent of other discourses, in particular independent of theology or religion, and independent of course, any kind of metaphysical speculation. After 2 centuries of the attempt to develop an autonomous moral theory, Griffin says, this tradition is in crisis. It can provide neither a credible defense of moral objectivity or of doing the common good, nor any motivation to adopt a moral way of life. In addition, it cannot account for the ordinary moral thinking and feeling of human beings everywhere. Autonomous morals cannot, therefore, provide any basis for democratic world government or for overcoming the global crisis. Thus, it seems to me Griffin does not enter the philosophical conversation primarily for philosophical reasons, but rather because he regards overcoming certain philosophical issues as paramount to creating the kind of global ethics that can provide a grounding for the world government that would be capable of effectively dealing with the global crisis. Thus, if overcoming the current world crisis through the creation of global democratic government is indeed Griffin's purpose, his moral theory, though certainly not purely utilitarian, may be more utilitarian than his emphasis on objective moral norms might lead us to think. He writes, for example, quote, "It is widely recognized that the creation of a global democratic government would be the only way to achieve several desirable results, such as overcoming the war system, which makes imperialism impossible, and protecting the human rights of all people." Whitehead's philosophy provides cosmological support for aesthetic, religious, and moral experience and intuitions, and for civilized life. In sharp contrast with those who seek an autonomous moral theory, Griffin insists that morals must be grounded in metaphysical and theistic ideas. But not any metaphysical or theistic ideas will do. Traditional theism, for example, is no longer credible, and its valorization of power as divine omnipotence is morally objectionable. The advantages of a Whiteheadian, Hartsonian, naturalistic theism are that it can both be supported on rational grounds and make sense of our basic religious and moral intuitions. So there's a kind of rational side and then a kind of empirical side to his argument. Obviously, the theism relevant here is not traditional theism with its notion of omnipotence and impassibility. In this conference and conversation, I suppose, there's no need for me to rehearse Griffin's account of Whitehead. It is, in my view, both cogent and correct, reflecting his many years of very close study of Whitehead. In this context, what Griffin does especially well, I think, at least for me, is to remind us of how profoundly concerned Whitehead was with morality, something that can be easily forgotten in the light of Whitehead's own emphasis on aesthetic values. And Griffin does this appropriately, in my view, by making use of both Whitehead's primordial nature of God as the source of felt ideals for every new occasion, and of the consequent nature of God as that which gives everlasting importance to human actions, what Whitehead called importance for the universe. It might, however, be useful to review Griffin's somewhat unique use of theism as grounds of morality. While a profoundly sophisticated Whiteheadian, Hartsonian account of God lies behind Griffin's appeal to theism as necessary for an adequate moral theory, often for the sake of argument, and maybe more than just for the sake of argument, but for the sake of pursuing common morality, theism is understood very, very minimally. For example, as involving perception of something holy, or where theos is understood simply as a place where moral norms exist, or where God is simply the ideal observer regarded as actual. All of these are ways of getting at a kind of very basic sense of theism rather than a developed theistic philosophy. This minimal theism, Griffin holds, is both consistent with an ideal observer account of right and wrong that is needed for moral theory and is rooted in a religious drive that is common to all people. Of course, this minimal theism has to be embedded in some richer version of theism, which for Griffin is process theism. But Griffin does not claim that process theism has to be adopted by all who seek a universal morality. This is why Griffin can rightly claim to be a deeply religious pluralist. But what is required for a universal morality is some minimal theism, some belief that moral principles are not all arbitrary, but part of the nature of things. And it is not only theism that makes Whitehead's philosophy especially useful for morals. His account of experience, particularly of non-sensory experience, making feelings of others basic to his metaphysics, is equally important for grounding morality. It's not enough that God makes ideals available to every occasion of experience. Such values have to be experienced in some way that is not simply a violation of what is known by science. Whitehead advocates what Griffin calls a re-enchanted universe. Given his account of non-sensory experience, especially his account of causal feelings, Whitehead could regard the experience of moral ideals as involving genuine perception on our part, referring to our experience of ideals entertained, of ideals aimed at, of ideals achieved, of ideals defaced, as our experience of the deity of the universe. At the same time, Whitehead's view of non-sensory experience provides a way of accounting for sympathy. The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion and conformally appropriated as a subjective passion. In the language appropriate to the higher stages of experience, the primitive element is sympathy, that is, feeling the feelings in another and feeling conformally with another. By providing rational grounds for holding that an omniscient God could not be evil, Griffin finds Hartshorne's idea of an absolutely ethical to be useful here. Hartshorne thought that divine experience should be thought of in analogy to our direct experience of our bodies, a kind of knowledge that is sympathetic. Divine omniscience, knowing all that can be known, rules out any need for divine altruism, as all interests are included within God's own. This lack of a need for altruism removes any basis for imagining that an omniscient being might not be sympathetic to the interests of other sentient beings, since omniscience makes for a certain and absolute coincidence of other interests and self-interest. If ethical means being motivated by concern for the interests of others, then God alone is absolutely ethical. For to know interests fully and concretely and to share them are indistinguishable. This means that God's goodness is not contingent, as some have claimed. The necessary connection between divine omniscience and impartial sympathy for all sentient beings is not an ad hoc assertion, but one which follows from a general analysis of the nature of direct perceptual knowledge of other sentient beings. Process theism also affirms the reality of limited human freedom. Self-determination, that in Whitehead's philosophy arises to some degree in every actual occasion as creativity or final causation is a basic presupposition of moral life, required to make any sense at all of human moral responsibility. In sum, process theism provides support for the basic presuppositions of the kind of morality that can be used to support the creation of an effective democratic global government that can begin to deal with the global crisis. Now, to this point, I have simply tried to present Griffin's ideas on morality. What he has done, I think, is to identify a global crisis, argue that any effective solution to this crisis must include global democratic government, show that most contemporary ethical or moral theory does not affirm the reality of objective values and therefore cannot be used to support universal morality or world government, and finally make a case for the relevance of a Whiteheadian, Hartsonian process theism for the kind of moral theory that could effectively contribute to creating the requisite world government. Now, I'd like to turn briefly to some limited, partially Buddhist responses to Griffin's proposals. I should confess, I think, that so far as I can tell, I have no substantive disagreement at all with what I have read of Griffin's moral and religious philosophy. What I sometimes have qualms about is his choice of terms. The meaning of terms is, of course, as we all know, very relative, highly contextual, dependent, such that what is appropriate in one context may be very inappropriate in another. One important context of Griffin's writing is Anglo-American philosophy. He has, in a sense, joined a particular conversation, albeit a conversation that points beyond itself to the matter of universal ethics and overcoming the world crisis. I, on the other hand, have been living and working in East Asia for nearly 25 years, primarily in interfaith and intercultural relations from a particular Buddhist perspective. I do not want to join the conversation to which Griffin has brought so much energy and wisdom. I don't think I have anything to contribute to that conversation. Nothing to say that Griffin has not already said better than I could. Thus, our contexts, both cultural and disciplinary, have been different. Here I want to hold up a few uses of language that I think, while appropriate in the context in which Griffin has used them, will not be as useful in promoting an international or intercultural approach to creating a universal morality that can overcome the world crisis. Part of what makes development of an effective universal morality nearly impossible is the typically assumed antithesis in the West between individual good and the general or the common good. Christian teachers and theologians have long stressed that what morality requires is complete altruism, complete selfless behavior for the benefit of others. Thus, in the case of human beings, there is a total divide between the interests of the self and the interests of all others. Being complete and perfect, God is radically different from human beings. It is impossible for God to have any selfish interest. His love is perfect, agape. Mortals should, of course, try to emulate divine love completely free of self-interest. But of course, inevitable sin ensures that such completely selfless behavior is impossible for human beings. For us, there is a radical disjunction between our individual interests and the good of others. What mortals can do is to confess and atone for their inevitable shortcomings, their inevitable self-interest, through the instrumentalities of churches and other religious institutions. It's a very convenient arrangement. Griffin, I think, like Whitehead and John Cobb, effectively uses process philosophy to argue that genuine individual interest is part of the general good and should be seen as such. Unfortunately, such a position lacks strong religious support in the West, as Western religious traditions have typically presupposed the correctness of an extreme antithesis between individual interests and the common good. Process thinkers can, however, move beyond inherited assumptions of the West, where they could find ample religious support for their position in the Buddhist idea and ideal of the Bodhisattva, arguably the central ethical ideal of Mahayana Buddhism, not of all Buddhism, but of Mahayana Buddhism. In some Western understandings of the Bodhisattva, probably based on Christian assumptions, it is said that the Bodhisattva is one who selflessly and sacrificially forgoes the Bodhisattva's own awakening in order to help others. But in the Lotus Sutra, and in much of East Asian Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is one who, based on the basic Buddhist understanding of interdependence, often misleadingly called codependent arising, recognizes that no one can be saved unless all are saved. The individual Bodhisattva's own interest, in other words, is in harmony with the interests of all living beings. Of course, any individual may have selfish individual interests, but a Bodhisattva is one who is wise enough to know that his or her own genuine interest is included within the common good. The Bodhisattva is not, therefore, required to be totally selfless in order to help others. The Bodhisattva way is also entirely consistent with Whitehead's and Griffin's notion of maximizing importance, in which importance is understood to be a very general notion applicable to religion, art, science, logic, morality, and so forth. Buddhists speak of awakening and of awakened behavior. Buddhist interpretations of their own tradition differ, of course, but basic is the idea that the goal of Buddhist teachings is awakened life, the way of the Bodhisattva, a life in which a variety of physical, mental, and spiritual, aesthetic, social, and ethical aims are realized in accord with the first vow of the Bodhisattva to work for the salvation of all. And it is apparent that such a life is highly relative both to the interests of those with whom one interacts and relative to one's own capacities, physical, social, and moral. The Bodhisattva does the best that he or she can do in a particular situation that has arisen in a particular causal context. A moral code or a set of precepts may provide guidance for such a life, but adherence to precepts is not what is finally the way of the Bodhisattva or the ideal way of life. We have many stories about bodhisattvas who could care less about precepts. In fact, there's one story about a previous life of the Buddha in which he's a bodhisattva who cares less about precepts. The bodhisattva's vow connects present life both with the past, often a mythical past or origin, in which the vow is made, with the future, the not yet, into which the vow is projected, maximizing importance in the present. Bodhisattvas live with gratitude to the past that has formed them and with hope toward a largely unknowable future that they are in the process of using skillful means to create. The Bodhisattva is unusually aware both of his or her own Buddha nature and of the Buddha nature of others. In principle, this is no different from being responsive to the divine element in experience, no different both metaphysically and no different in terms of its behavioral consequences of identifying with the good of others and with the good of all others, the common good. In other words, while the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of the Bodhisattva is not normally taken to be a moral ideal, or at least not merely a moral ideal, it could provide a rich religious resource for the kind of moral life advocated in process thought. Now, philosophy, or I should say Western philosophy. My own training is in philosophy. I'm still a member in good standing of the American Philosophical Association. I used to hope that philosophy could actually be of help to the world. I no longer think so. I no longer think so, at least if that is what is meant, if what is meant by philosophy is what goes on, for the most part, in philosophy departments in American and British universities. Griffin writes that the first of the 10 core doctrines of process philosophy is the integration of moral, aesthetic, and religious intuitions with the most general doctrines of the sciences into a self-consistent worldview as one of the central tasks of philosophy in our time. Part of me wants to cheer here, but I also react with a hope that we not leave this task to philosophy, as philosophy is commonly understood. At least not if by philosophy we mean what the vast majority of professional Anglo-American philosophers appear to mean by this term. Of course, Griffin and Whitehead and Cobb and I have a much broader vision of what philosophy might be. Process thinkers, including Griffin, of course, have a broader conception of what philosophy is. I imagine that wide use of the term process thought rather than process philosophy by this center points in that direction. And it is no accident that the center has reached out to an enormously wide range of non-philosophers for the purpose of enriching process thought. Process philosophy can be recovered process philosophy can be recovered for love of wisdom. But I fear that it has more and more come to mean the thinking of a very small group of people whose professional work is almost entirely a conversation among themselves. While such philosophers may think that what they do is the whole of philosophy, right now we have in my department at Renmin University an well-known American philosopher who simply assumes that what Anglo-American philosophers do is the whole of philosophy. He's saying this in China. People are astonished. Western hegemony in philosophy may not be the best way to pursue universal agreement on morality, at least not in any kind of democratic way. Non-Western peoples, and not just Asian peoples, know very well from their own experience that Western thinkers can be counted on to assume the superiority of Western customs and habits of thought. Perhaps all people do that. It's not a surprise, then, that the only non-Western participant in the drafting of the very Western Universal Declaration of Human Rights, P.C. Chang, was disappointed with the results and suggested that the other members of the committee would benefit from studying Confucianism. Griffin has chosen to enter a conversation which he deems very important for dealing with or failing to deal with what he properly sees as a global crisis. But I think, and I'm sure Griffin agrees, there can be no hope at all for moving toward world government or ameliorating any of the components of the global crisis without inclusion of non-Western voices, with their own sensibilities, values, and habits of thought. A culturally and religiously wider conversation might also result in some significant changes in perspective among all the participants. And I just want to mention briefly that I was very pleased in your packet to find this announcement next week, a conference on the place of harmony in ecological civilization, in which people here at the center will engage in conversation with people from China. And I think this is just an excellent step in the right direction. I have a section in here on human rights, which I'm going to skip. I probably shouldn't, but I have reservations about the language of civil rights. Sorry, Richard. Of human rights, I'm sorry. No problem with civil rights, human rights. I think the language of human rights, the language of rights actually, has embedded within it its connotations the idea of something that's granted by a higher power. And I think that inevitably carries over into language when we talk about human rights. That's not what human rights advocates mean by human rights, but I think the language of rights has that disadvantage. I also think, probably because I live in a different world, that today human rights is most often, in the public sphere, I'm not talking now about philosophical conversations, in the public sphere, human rights is most always followed by violations. In other words, human rights language has become a kind of propaganda tool for criticizing others. And it becomes part of the war that's going on, increasingly going on, between the United States and China. Well, I decided I wouldn't talk about that, and I'm going on to talk about it, but I should shut up and move on to some other things. David Griffin writes, quote, "To move forward, Whitehead is saying civilization requires a sense of importance based on a reverence-evoking insight into the nature of the universe. This surely is correct, but such a sense of importance may not readily translate into human rights, especially not when such rights are interpreted not by American process thinkers, but by the American government and by CIA-funded organizations, especially those operating in East Asia. Human rights talk, I believe, is being used to further exacerbate tensions between the two most powerful countries in the world, and is often felt to be an example of American bullying. This is true, by the way, even for organizations that I've supported all my life, like Amnesty International, which is very much enamored of the language of human rights, but which I think is not always so helpful. I'm not suggesting that all talk of human rights be abandoned even by process thinkers. It is a very important part of Western traditions, but we should not, I think, expect that in the long run such language can be a part of what everyone agrees on, that is, of a universal morality. For that, I think we might better turn to Whitehead's notion of peace, found in the final chapter of Adventures of Ideas, where there is a much stronger connection between Whitehead's philosophy and East Asian values. Now, I think Griffin, following Whitehead, is correct in affirming that all people experience some kind of holy, some sense of importance and value in the very character of the universe. I think this is very difficult to express. I think David has tried very hard to do that in a variety of ways and probably succeeds at it as well as we can expect anybody to. But, he says, the religious sensibility common to all people and common to all religions is a desire for harmony with the Tao, or Brahman, or Buddha, or even the divine will. A religious sense of the holy may be associated with a morality of right and wrong, but it is not always so. In Mahayana Buddhism, for example, one is much more likely to think in terms of better and worse than in terms of right and wrong. As Whitehead says, the worth of men consists in their liability to persuasion. They can persuade and can be persuaded by the disclosure of alternatives, the better and the worse. Thus, Tiantai Buddhism asserts that even the Buddha, the best of living beings, includes an element of evil. And we have countless stories of bodhisattvas with very human failings, such as seeking fame and gain, who are nonetheless models for us. What's more, virtually all of Mahayana Buddhism now affirms that there is an element of the Buddha in the most evil of living beings. So there's no absolute right and wrong. According to Mahayana Buddhism, others should always be respected, both because they have Buddha nature and because doing so is most likely to produce good results, both for those being respected and those doing the respecting. Buddha nature is not something given, not even by the Buddha. Buddha nature is rather inherent in all living beings. It cannot be granted or taken away. Good results are teleological and highly relative. Seldom, if ever, do we know what will produce the best fruit, but we do have ideas based on centuries of human experience about what is more likely to lead to good results. Thus, rules such as rules against murder and lying and stealing are good common sense based on human experience, including experience of what we hold to be holy. Similarly, perhaps human rights may be expressions of good sense about what is needed for human civilization to advance or even to survive. Given a process conception of deity, it is no problem at all for me to agree with the idea that God participates in every creature's creation of itself. My main concern here is a tendency for us to inadvertently resort to traditional classic theistic notions without defending their appropriateness, or maybe even not being aware of it. For example, at one point, Griffin refers to God as the creator who brought us forth. Though we can, of course, make good sense of such a notion. In process theism, whether Whitehead's or Hartshorne's or Griffin's, I submit it is inappropriate to say that God brings us forth. We bring ourselves forth with the help of our ancestors, our antecedents, and with the participation of God or the Buddha. Here too, I think that East Asian Buddhist emphasis on gratitude to the past, often called ancestor veneration, including not only our blood ancestors, but also our teachers, near and remote, and even the institutions that have contributed to our lives, that this emphasis might serve as a valuable corrective to Western tendencies toward individualism. This could be especially true, I think, when understood in the light of process philosophy. Whitehead wrote, God can be termed the creator of each temporal actual entity. But the phrase is apt to be misleading by its suggestion that the ultimate creativity of the universe is to be ascribed to God's volition. The true metaphysical position, this is all quoting Whitehead, the true metaphysical position is that God is the aboriginal instance of this creativity and is therefore the aboriginal condition which qualifies its action. He also writes, the initial stage of the aim is rooted in the nature of God, and its completion depends on the self-causation of the subject superject, the actual occasion itself. If we prefer the phraseology, we can say that God and the actual world jointly constitute the character of the creativity for the initial phase of the novel concrescence, unquote. I do not mean to suggest that there is an experience of God, and thus I do not mean to suggest here that in the experience of God, and thus the inclusion of God in every experience, God is merely inert. For Griffin, God is indeed actively present, part of the causation of every individual. Buddhists can agree that the Buddha is present in all of our moments of experience, all of them. The individual always creates itself out of its past, which is causal and efficacious, with suitable aims made available by God. If we focus on the creativity or novelty, the real creator of the actual occasion is itself. Every actual entity creates itself. If we focus on what is the dominant influence on any individual occasion, the real creator of an actual occasion is its past, its ancestors, to which we think we should express gratitude. If we focus on God's unique relation to all other occasions, we can say that God is the creator. The aims made available by God are necessary for there to be any creative event or creation anywhere. So here, I don't use the language of ultimates, but I do want to suggest that in Whitehead's view, there are three creators of every occasion. Buddhism, at least some forms of it, is very compatible with Whitehead's and Griffin's understanding of the relationship of God to others as one of interdependence. Not only do we need the help of the Buddha and his bodhisattvas, the Buddha, we are told in countless ways, needs our help to get his work done. In the Lotus Sutra, for example, Buddhas travel all over the universe, but no Buddha ever travels without having at least one bodhisattva. I said at one point, one bodhisattva to carry his suitcase. More importantly, our Buddha, the Buddha of this world, generally known as Shakyamuni, clearly needs the help of human bodhisattvas to do his work in this world. I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that without the help of others, the Buddha could not be the actual Buddha. For me, this raises the question of whether God's will should be regarded as equivalent to initial aims. Of course, we can talk, as Griffin does, about being in harmony with divine will, and in some contexts that may be a very appropriate way of speaking. But the more natural connotation of divine will, even in East Asia, is that it is something to obey. Once again, this language, it seems to me, comes from and is suggested of a system involving obedience to a ruler. More consistent, it seems to me, it would be to say that initial aims are offered by or presented by God. We should not forget that Whitehead speaks of a concept of God in which the goodness of God replaces older emphasis on the will of God. Now, in conclusion, my reservations about use of the term God's will should not be taken to be against in any way what Griffin's purpose is in the argument, namely to show that within a properly reconstructed theism, that is a process theism, God is in some way the ultimate criterion of better or worse. My problem is that the language in which the argument is sometimes cast, a language which I think is not representative of Whitehead's or Hartshorne's thinking, nor likely to be accepted in truly interfaith and cross-cultural settings, that is, in settings in which Griffin's ideal of global democracy might be pursued. In other words, I'm saying that we're going to have to be very careful about what kind of language we use when we leave the conversation among philosophers and into a conversation, a cross-cultural, interdisciplinary conversation. While I hope these contentious qualms will at least give us something to think about, as I'm sure he would be quick to admit, David Griffin's ethics, which is both philosophical and theological, is not yet complete. What I have seen is a great, great beginning. And I have tried to make some suggestions as to how David Griffin and others might pursue the larger project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gene, for a very rich paper. I don't quite see how even the rejuvenated David Griffin can possibly respond to all those points, but he's going to take the first turn, and then since we're running late on time, we'll have a somewhat shorter discussion period. David?
Well, thank you very much, Gene. John Cobb asked famously some years ago, can a Christian be a Buddhist too? Well, Gene Reeves is a living example of that. At least he shows that a Unitarian Universalist can be a Buddhist too. I want to just pick up 2 points. The one about the notion of global democracy, which yesterday there was some resistance to it. And let me tell how, I worked on that for 10 years. So there were 2 treatments of it, and that's appropriate because I spent 10 years of my life on that, although I've hardly published anything about it, so I haven't put out the argument. And I learned that in my classes, I taught that class maybe 4 times on dealing with that. And the first few weeks, the students were really scratching their heads and looking, and then it started going along. And by the end of the class party, at the end of the class, we had a class party, and one guy came forward and confessed. He says, the first several weeks of the class, I thought you were crazy. I thought global government, that's just nuts. And then I started laying out the arguments and for this, ecological issues and war and the nuclear issue. So, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, I don't expect anybody here to believe it. I expect you to believe on that particular issue, I am nuts. Maybe more nuts than I am on 9/11 or parapsychology. But so let's not take time to talk about that. Wait till you take my class. Now the other issue, the issue of atheism, there's so much misunderstanding about what atheism is and what I mean by it. Gene referred to the fact that I entered into the particular argument of recent ethicists. And I went through many of the leading ones, including the ones that are best known, Richard Rorty and Jürgen Habermas, but also the leading ethicists at Oxford, Cambridge, and even Richard Falk's alma mater, Princeton. And they all agree on this point, that the universe contains no basis for ethics. That's what I mean by atheism. So when you hear atheism, you quite often mean, oh, they reject the Christian God, or they reject the Buddha, the Bible's God. Yeah, but a whole lot more. They reject Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, because all those traditions hold that there is some source of moral rightness in the very nature of things. Whether you call it the Buddhist, or whether you use Confucianist term or Islamic terms or whatever, there's an agreement that the universe is not completely devoid of norms. That's what I mean by atheism. So by theism, I mean, just as Gene said, a very minimal I've got a maximal theism for my, work as a Christian theologian, and somewhat minimal theism for interreligious dialogue. But for this, a very minimal theism, it means that there is a theos, and that simply means that the universe, there is some place where there are norms. Now, Whitehead calls that the primordial nature of God, but you can call it anything you want to, as long as you say there are objective norms, right and wrong, better and worse, in the very nature of things. So that's my argument, that if we're going to have any kind of global ethic, of course, I mean any kind of personal ethic too, but certainly any kind of a global ethic, we have to have some sort of source for norms, and not just say that everything is arbitrary, everything is our invention, as many of these moralists would put it. So finally, Gene, I want to say, if I understood correctly, you went to Japan originally to write a commentary on the Lotus Sutra. And every time I meet Gene, I say, well, when's that going to come forth? And now, you just mentioned a Buddhist natural theology. Is that a different thing, or is that the same thing as the commentary on the Lotus Sutra?
Actually, I've written commentaries.
No, but I mean...
But the Buddhist natural theology is probably what you have in mind.
Yes, I do. So I'm very... so if there were no other value to this conference, that it leads Gene Reeves to finally put out his Buddhist natural theology, it will not be in vain. So, thank you.